I picked this girl up. I asked for sex, and she said no. And I stabbed her and put her in a snowbank
From the 80s.
with it.
Did you ever tell anyone what you did or talk about it at any time?
No,
How often did the crime pop back into your head? How often did you think about it over the last 50 years?
hardly ever.
And why do you think that is?
I think I am cold-blooded.
Miller claims some of the cover-up.
Did you get rid of the weapon or did you hold on to that knife afterwards?
I threw it away.
Where did you throw it away?
Well, near where I used to live, it's like a little swamp area. I threw it into the water.
By
At
Pine
around
City?
10:30 on the morning of February 15, 1974, a 25-year-old artist named Mary Schlais said goodbye to her roommate. Judith picked up a small cardboard sign that read Madison and walked out of her uptown Minneapolis apartment to start hitchhiking toward an art show in Chicago. Less than 3 hours later, a man out walking his dog near Elk Creek Lake in rural Wisconsin saw two people struggling on a dead-end road, as if fighting. When he came back through, he found a young woman's body, partially buried in snow. Her body was still warm. She had been stabbed more than a dozen times. Left behind in the snow beside her, an orange and black stocking cap that didn't belong to her. It would take 50 years, a wrongly accused serial killer, and a college genealogy lab in New Jersey to find out whose cap it actually was. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In February 1974, Richard Nixon was less than 7 months from resigning the presidency, and the Watergate hearings dominated every evening newscast. Gas lines still snaked around city blocks from the oil crisis the winter before. It was a strange, unsettled moment in the country, and yet, in the upper Midwest, something as ordinary as hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago still didn't raise an eyebrow. Mary Schlais wasn't reckless. She was simply living the way a lot of young people her age lived in 1974, thumb out, cardboard sign, trusting that someone heading the right direction would eventually stop. Springbrook Township sits in Dunn County, Wisconsin, 90 miles east of Minneapolis along Interstate 94, quiet farmland and small lakes. The kind of place where a dead-end road near Elk Creek Lake wasn't somewhere people expected to find anything at all, let alone a body. Mary Schlais was born November 11, 1949, and grew up in Champlin, Minnesota, with her two brothers. She graduated with honors from the University of Minnesota with a degree in art, earning scholarships along the way. She was fluent in German and Danish, was beginning to learn Japanese, and had recently exhibited her sculptures, paintings, and drawings, work centered on women, at the Women's Institute for Social Change. She loved to travel, often hitchhiking to do it, and on the morning of February 15th, she was heading toward an art show in Chicago, planning to pass through Madison on the way. She wore a tan fur-lined coat over a maroon turtleneck and blue jeans, and carried her purse. Her roommate Judith was the last person who saw her leave. The man who found her, walking his dog near Elk Creek Lake, had seen the struggle from a distance and assumed, at first, that it was nothing. Two people, maybe an argument, nothing requiring him to get involved. When he came back through and saw what was actually lying in the snow, he called the sheriff's office in Springbrook Township immediately. Investigators arrived to find Mary's body partially covered with snow, but still warm to the touch, meaning whatever happened had happened within the hour, not the day. She had been stabbed more than a dozen times, in the chest, neck, and abdomen, with a broken nose and other injuries from the struggle. She had fought. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms told that part of the story clearly enough without anyone needing to say it out loud. Beside her in the snow, an orange and black stocking cap. Human hairs were recovered from inside it that didn't belong to her. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office, led at the time by Sheriff Darrell Sognsvold, moved fast and moved hard. They followed up on more than 400 leads, tips from across the country, even from Canada. Posters went up. Newspapers ran her photograph. Around 100 formal interviews were conducted, with far more informal conversations on top of that. The only person who'd actually witnessed any part of it, a man named Dennis Anderson, was questioned extensively, shown photo lineups that led nowhere, and hypnotized, twice, in the hope that something buried in his memory might surface under the right conditions. Nothing came of it. No suspect. No name. Just a description. A white male, 25 to 35, about 5'8", slim build, light brown hair, and separately, from the man who'd seen the struggle, a man with reddish long hair and a bushy mustache. The car, witnesses said, was orange or gold. With no hard evidence at the scene beyond a hat nobody could trace, the case went cold within months. The years did something to this case that almost no other cold case experiences quite the same way. They didn't just pass. They actively misled. During the 1980s and into the 1990s, investigators looked seriously at Randall Woodfield, a former Green Bay Packers draft pick turned serial killer, known as the I-5 Killer, convicted of murders along the West Coast through the 1970s and 80s. Woodfield's timeline put him traveling from Portland to Green Bay around the time Mary was killed, and he roughly matched a witness's description. For a long stretch, he looked like the answer. In 2009, 35 years after her death, Mary's body was exhumed specifically so investigators could run advanced DNA testing that hadn't existed in 1974. 2 years later, in 2011, that testing pointed toward Woodfield. Authorities believed, for over a decade, that they finally had their men. They didn't. Woodfield was never charged. He was eventually ruled out entirely, meaning that for more than 10 years, the best lead this case ever had was the wrong one. And the real answer sat untouched the entire time, in a stocking cap that had been sitting in evidence since the day it was found. Mary's brother, Don Schlais, lived through every one of those false turns. Her niece, Nina Mary Schlais, was born after Mary's death and grew up the way so many of these families grow up, carrying a relative she never met, carrying a question that kept almost getting answered and then sliding away again. By the 2020s, Dunn County investigators had reached the same conclusion law enforcement agencies across the country were reaching about cases like this one. Traditional DNA databases could only ever find a suspect whose own profile was already in the system. Mary's killer had never been arrested for anything that would have put him there. The only path left was investigative genetic genealogy, tracing not the suspect directly, but his relatives, branch by branch, until one name remained. Dunn County partnered with the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Working from the partial DNA profile recovered from the hat scrapings, genealogist Misty Gillis and her colleagues began building a family tree from the smallest, most distant matches available. The first candidate they found, a man identified only as Ng, living in Casper, Wyoming, agreed to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. Investigator Dan Westland flew out, interviewed him in person. Gillis determined he wasn't a contributor. A second candidate, D.B., living in East Tawas, Michigan, also cooperated fully, also came back excluded. Then the team found something that should have made this faster than it turned out to be. The suspect they were tracing toward had been adopted. That single fact had quietly kept his name out of every genealogical thread anyone had followed for years, because the family tree built from blood didn't match the family he'd actually grown up in. Working around that, investigators eventually traced the profile to a woman identified as T.E. They confirmed her biological father was a man born May 2, 1940, John Keith Miller, and her mother confirmed she had been married to him from 1973 to 1977. Investigators reached out to T.E. directly. She agreed to provide a DNA sample. It matched the hat. John Keith Miller had spent his entire life one state over from where Mary died, in Minnesota, most recently in an apartment in Austin, Minnesota, directly across the street from the local police station, before being moved to an assisted living facility in Owatonna. He had a record, armed robbery, years earlier, after sticking up a convenience store clerk, but nothing that had ever required his DNA to be collected. He had never once been a name on Dunn County's list. 50 years of investigation, 400 leads, a wrongly accused serial killer, and John Miller had simply never come up. On November 7, 2024, Dunn County Sheriff's Office investigators went to his door. They told him plainly what they had. He denied knowing anything about it. He said he had no idea how his DNA could be connected to the scene. Then they showed him a photograph of the stocking cap. "All right," he said. "I did it. I put her in the snowbank." He told investigators that on February 15, 1974, he'd picked up Mary while she was hitchhiking. As they drove, he asked her for sex. She said no. He reached above the visor for a knife he kept stashed there and stabbed her in the back as she leaned forward, continuing until she stopped moving. She had fought him. That was where the defensive wounds came from. Afterward, he tried to hide her body in the snowbank, panicked when another car passed, and fled, leaving the cap behind without realizing it. He was arrested that day. Investigators recorded the interview in full. In a jailhouse series of interviews afterward with KARE 11 reporter Lou Raguzzi, Miller went further than the criminal complaint required him to. "I picked this girl up. I asked for sex, and she said no. And I stabbed her and put her in a snowbank," he said. "Maybe I have no feelings. I have no idea." Raguzzi asked if he'd known, back in 1974, that he'd left the cap behind. "I didn't know I left it there until I saw the pictures," Miller said. "I never thought anything would be traced back to me. That's just the way I was thinking." The witness who'd seen his car had misremembered the color, orange or gold, when Miller said it had actually been a blue 1972 Gremlin, and that single mistaken detail had given him 50 years of false confidence. "I just figured I stabbed her and put her in the snowbank, and that was it," he said. "And that I got away with it." Asked how often the crime had come back to him across 5 decades of ordinary life, Miller paused before answering. "Maybe I'm cold," he said. "I think I am cold-blooded." Miller told Raguzzi there wouldn't be a trial. "I'm gonna plead guilty because I know I am," he said. "Why go through all the mess? Put me away for the rest of my life." He kept that word, mostly. On March 27, 2025, he appeared in Dunn County Circuit Court and entered a plea of no contest to first-degree intentional homicide, the legal near equivalent of pleading guilty, accepting the conviction without formally admitting every fact in open court. Prosecuting attorney Andrea Amadon Nodal spoke first, describing the brutality of the crime, Miller's lack of remorse, and the fact that several of Mary's own family members had died without ever getting the answer this hearing was finally about to give. "Life in prison, frankly, doesn't seem like enough," she said. "But it is the only thing this court can order." Judge James Peterson turned to Miller directly and gave him the chance to speak. "You don't have to say anything at all if you don't want to," the judge told him. "It can't be held against you." Miller said nothing. No one from Mary's family spoke at the hearing either. The weight of it, 51 years in the making, didn't need more words added to it that afternoon. "I don't know if there's anything that could make up for the loss of life," Judge Peterson said. Then he passed sentence. "Mr. Miller, I do hereby sentence you to life imprisonment in the Wisconsin prison system. Mandatory life, with no possibility attached to a number of years. First-degree intentional homicide under Wisconsin law leaves a judge no other sentence to give." Miller was also ordered to pay $2,200 in restitution to Mary's family, plus more than $480 to cover the cost of extraditing him to Wisconsin. Nina Mary Schlais, Mary's niece, born after the aunt she never met had already become a 50-year-old question mark in her family's history, read a statement after the sentencing. "While no verdict can undo the pain of losing Mary, we take comfort in knowing the man responsible for her murder has been held accountable," she said. Mary Schlais was more than a victim. She was a brilliant, independent woman, a gifted artist, an equestrian, a world traveler, and a scholar. She graduated with honors from the University of Minnesota and had ambitious plans to continue her studies, teach, and make a lasting impact through her art. This case is a reminder that justice has no time limit, and to families still searching for the truth, Let Mary's story be a testament that persistence, science, and dedication can bring a long-awaited closure. The family said they plan to donate part of the restitution money to Ramapo College's Genetic Genealogy Center, the same lab that had finally done what 50 years of leads, 400 tips, 2 rounds of hypnosis, and one wrongly accused serial killer never could. Here is how this case actually came together, in order. A stocking cap, left behind in a panic, in 1974. 50 years in evidence storage while the technology to read it caught up. A wrongly accused serial killer who absorbed over a decade of investigative attention that should have gone elsewhere. A genealogy lab in New Jersey building a family tree from the smallest possible starting match. An adoption that had quietly hidden the right bloodline for years. And finally, a daughter, a stranger to all of this, agreeing to give a DNA sample that confirmed exactly who her father was. Take away any one of those 6 things, and John Miller dies in an Owatonna assisted living facility, having gotten away with it, just like he always assumed he would. Nobody was ever held responsible for the 13 years investigators spent looking at the wrong man. Not for the false confidence that came with it, not for whatever attention and resources went toward Woodfield instead of toward a stocking cap that had been sitting in storage the entire time, waiting. John Miller spent 50 years, living an unremarkable life 2 hours from the place he'd left a woman's body in the snow. He worked, presumably. He grew old. He ended up, of all places, in an apartment directly across the street from a police station, close enough to see it every day, never once needing to worry about it. He never explained why he kept the knife at all, or why, when asked, he could still describe exactly where he'd thrown it into a swamp near where he used to live, 50 years later, without hesitation. This case leaves behind 2 things worth carrying forward. First, a piece of evidence that can't yet be matched to anyone is not the same thing as a dead end. Mary's stocking cap sat in evidence for half a century, useless without a name to compare it against, until investigative genetic genealogy gave investigators a way to search for relatives instead of the suspect directly. If you have a loved one in a cold case with preserved biological evidence and no match, ask the investigating agency directly whether that evidence has ever been submitted to a genetic genealogy lab, not just a traditional criminal database. That conversation can start with your county sheriff's office or your state's cold case unit. Second, a wrongly identified suspect can cost a case more than just time. For over a decade, investigators believed they had their answer in Randall Woodfield, and that belief didn't speed anything up. If anything, it gave a different name somewhere else the cover to keep living quietly, unbothered, for years longer than he otherwise might have. If you're ever in a position to evaluate a tip or a lead in a case that matters to you, ask what's actually confirming it, not just what makes it plausible. If this story made you think, please press subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for watching until the very end. The dead-end road near Elk Creek Lake is still there. Springbrook Township is still a quiet stretch of Dunn County farmland, the kind of place nobody expects anything to happen. The same as it was in February 1974. Mary Schlais never made it to Chicago. She never got to keep painting the women she'd spent her short career trying to understand. She never got to meet a niece who would one day stand in a courtroom and call her brilliant, independent, a world traveler, a scholar, everything she actually was. Finally said out loud, 51 years late. Mary Schlais,